If you're talking about it, I'll be talking about it. Dennis Prager here. Join me this morning at 11, right here on AM 560, The Answer.
Dan and Amy, and pleased to be joined by James Fitzgerald. He's a retired FBI special agent and criminal profiler of significant renown. He and his team cracked the Unabomber case, you remember. He's also the author of a series of books, A Journey to the Center of the Mind, and the Unabomber case has been memorialized in a Netflix series called Manhunt that you should see. It's really good. Sam Worthington plays James Fitzgerald. Paul Bettany plays the Unabomber. Unabomber is an interesting case, too, for our discussion about those bombs that were deployed yesterday and the rush to judgment, the jumping to conclusions that people want to do for very convenient political reasons. Because you'll remember the infamous Unabomber sketch?
Mm-hmm.
Wrong guy.
Right.
Wrong. But people don't remember that. Wrong guy. That iconic sketch of the guy in the hoodie that was supposed to be the Unabomber. Wrong guy.
Oh, and then think about what happened to Mark Jewell. The Atlanta bombing during the Olympics. Wrong guy.
For more on this topic and how the investigation should proceed, at least, we're pleased to be joined by James Fitzgerald. James, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Amy. It's good to be on with you guys again. And don't forget Stephen Hatfield with the anthrax case.
Yeah, that's right.
I was cut out of that case as a profiler because I kept telling the people at headquarters, and the case was being run by Robert Mueller at the time. I said, he's not your guy. He's not your guy. We're looking for someone else. And they wouldn't listen to me. And another false guy there. He's a millionaire now, thanks to the lawsuit he filed. And, of course, a guy named Bruce Ivins was eventually arrested as the anthrax guy.
Yeah, Robert Mueller. Where have I heard that name before?
Mueller.
Right.
Well, the reason we have you on in part two, I know you don't have a GoFundMe page like Peter Strzok, so we want to profile your work in addition to get your insights. Let's talk about this case. So the president said all the right things yesterday, and that he'd be in touch, has been in touch with top law enforcement, and will be. You've got a lot of evidence because you have these bombs that reportedly could not be detonated that were sent and recovered. So then how does the FBI, how does law enforcement proceed from here?
Yeah, and I'm not sure and you may have officially heard that or reported that. I'm not sure of the actual functionality of these devices or the lethality. I mean, would they, go off like a firecracker? Would they go off at all? Or were they strictly made by design? Were they dummies? But obviously they are still designed and constructed by someone, probably one person. You can't rule out in these times that there's been a helper somewhere. And they're still going to break them down for every bit of forensic evidence they can get, looking at the real or pretend detonator, the power source, of course, the wiring, triggering mechanism, and any shrapnel wrapped around it. And they're going to do their best to determine where these particles, where these segments, where these pieces of metal and whatever they are came from. And that includes the battery, whatever. Remember, the Unabomber used to strip the skin off of his batteries, so they couldn't even be traced to a lot number in like a one distribution center in Mississippi or something. So we'll see if this guy was clever enough to do this. Even if there's even batteries or some kind of an initiator involved in these devices, we just don't know that yet in the public. But that's what's going to be looked for, and every one of those items is going to be searched, not just for fingerprints, DNA, but other aspects like the envelope will look for hairs and fibers, indented writing. So there's a lot of forensic work going on, along with what the regular investigators in the streets are doing, of course, with closed-circuit TV, witness interviews, and all that stuff.
And this is far from over. I mean, we have some breaking news. A ninth package, they say, has now been delivered or was en route to Vice President Joe Biden's home in Wilmington, Delaware. So that's still continuing. So a lot of people that were on, cable shows weren't impressed with the level of sophistication of the pipe bomb from what you saw, because all we're seeing, the one picture is the one that was sent to John Brennan at CNN. What do you make of that? And then the spelling was incorrect of his name. The spelling of Florida was wrong.
Yeah, and I think what we have here so far is a case of quantity over quality. This person now, I guess we're up to what, 8?
9.
I think Robert De Niro supposedly
Yep, that was 8.
Right.
has
De Niro's
a
restaurant.
suspicious package,
Yeah.
and yet none of them have detonated. And I never want to insult I was going to say serial bomber. Technically, this isn't a serial bomber by definition. He's a mass bomber, and that's when someone just does everything on one occasion. It could be a mass shooter. Serial bomber usually is weeks or months. Condit back in March was a serial bomber. Kaczynski certainly was a serial bomber, meaning the Unabomber. But this guy did basically everything at once or within a day or so. So it's interesting there. And, you're right, Amy. One of the first things that, I have an investigative hat I wear, I have a profiling hat, but also a forensic linguistic hat. And I saw the picture of the one device, and there's Debbie Wasserman Schultz. The last name, Schultz, is misspelled. The C is dropped.
Right.
And John Brennan's name is misspelled. One of the N's is missing from the middle of his last name. And I figured we had this guy who was, meaning the bomber, who was so full of hatred and anger and vitriol towards these people, towards, ostensibly Dems, liberals. And he knows, he follows the news all the time and puts everything together. And I'm sure he has flow charts and all on a wall of his house. And he puts these labels together and he misspells names of these two prominent people. One of them, one of his victims, the other one made to look like, a fake return address. I think that misspelling was done for a reason and purposefully. And sometimes people do that in these types of cases, whether it's just a letter itself or whatever, to kind of make it look like, well, look, I don't really know the people involved. I don't follow politics that closely. So, if I misspell the name, I'll throw people off. I think the misspelling is done for a reason because I think this person is something other than what he is pretending to be.
And so how do you, how do you start to kind of narrow in on the person in addition to the forensic evidence? I mean, because, of course, the conspiracy theories abound from this is somebody who fits the description you just offered to this is a false flag operation and so forth. So, if it's just looking online or in the public realm for people that are engaged in incendiary or borderline violent rhetoric and incitement to violence, boy, that's a lot of legwork to do, the amount of people that would potentially fit into that category. So how do you narrow the search?
Yeah, and the investigators on the ground, and there's probably hundreds of them at this point in the task force, no doubt the Secret Service, FBI, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, NYPD. You're going to have the postal inspectors most likely. Quite frankly, they're looking at everything they can get their hands on right now. They're not trying to pigeonhole this. Is it domestic terrorism? Is it international terrorism? Which I can't rule out, by the way, Dan and Amy. We had outsiders try to influence the 2016 election with Facebook ads and fake news and stuff like that. Well, what better way to influence an investigation this time around, since Facebook is, supposedly monitoring the ads and the fake news going up on those sites now, do something like this just to kind of create this tumult, which, quite frankly, this guy did. So again, the agents on the ground aren't too worried about categorizing what this is and even looking whether the person's a Dem or a Republican or a Libertarian or something in the middle. But usually what I found with these types of cases, these people who threaten, people who send anonymous letters in the workplace, whatever, it could be sort of benign, it could be a criminal matter somewhere else. They're not usually the ones that stand around and scream and pound their fist on the table and, I want this change. And they're not the ones, Antifa, burning buildings down or some other far right winger, challenging people, making threats. This may be someone who's a little more on the reserve side, a little more quiet, that knows he's not on a database somewhere, or at least not a major player, and he thinks he can get away with this for that reason. The person's going to have some kind of a social media presence, fingerprint, if you will, but it may not be the over-the-top one that sometimes we expect in cases like this. So, like I said, I think this person's going to fall in one of three categories. He's either a far right-wing person, just can't stand his targets and the Dems anymore. He's a far left-wing person who can't stand the GOP and is that false flag type of black op that many of us think it may be, or it could be an outside entity I wouldn't rule out the Russians at this point either, but there's going to be no cross-contamination. These people don't work together. It's going to be one or the other of these in these three categories, and that's where I'm pretty darn sure our suspect will eventually come from once he's identified.
Do you look back at instances that are recent and see if there's connections in a case like this? So, for example, these envelopes laced with white powder that were sent to Trump family members and the like. Do you look back and say, now is there a connection to that? Or do you kind of separate them as wholly independent events?
No, they can't be ruled out, and especially I believe they were fake powders,
Right.
and fake meaning they weren't WMDs or anthrax or rice or anything like that. And excuse me, I don't know if these IEDs, these bombs, are quote unquote fake or not. They certainly look real from the outside, but at some point we're going to find out whether they were functional or not. So no, I wouldn't. Putting talcum powder or something in an envelope and mailing it off is relatively simple and not too much pre-planning is really necessary or expenditure is necessary. Obviously, making upwards of 9 IEDs that look like pipe bombs, that's going to take some time, some tools, some effort, some privacy. Little Johnny and Mary aren't walking around in the kitchen waiting for Daddy to take them to a soccer practice when he's putting the devices together. He's sitting in a shed or a garage somewhere in private, and people aren't allowed to get in there. And he locks the door when he leaves. But all of a sudden, these things all go out within 1 or 2 days, and maybe Soros got his a day or two before that. And they would be important, too. It's one thing where he's mailing them from, but if he actually placed a few of them, including, they say, maybe outside of George Soros's home in the suburbs of New York City, looking at cell phone activity and, of course, any kind of surveillance footage from cameras would be invaluable in that regard. So there isn't an item or objective within an investigation that's not being uncovered right now. I've been on task forces like this back in the day as a profiler and an investigator, and it's nonstop around the clock. And that's what's happening right now, just like we saw it happen in Austin back in March. And within 2 weeks or so, this matter was put to rest, just like Mark Condit was.
Yeah, that's a good reference. James Fitzgerald, retired FBI special agent and famed criminal profiler from the Unabomber case, the books, A Journey to the Center of the Mind, the Netflix series, Manhunt. James Fitzgerald, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan and Amy. Take care.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.